Sarajevo, 1992. A woman named Admira Ismic and a man named Boško Brkić are trying to cross a bridge. They've been together for 9 years. She's Bosniak, he's Serb. They have a deal with both sides. Safe passage out of the city. They walk onto the bridge holding hands. Both are shot. Admira dies instantly. Boško is wounded, crawls toward her, and dies beside her. They lie there for 4 days. Neither side will allow anyone to retrieve the bodies. The city watches from windows. The couple becomes known as the Romeo and Juliet of Sarajevo. But this isn't a love story. It's something more disturbing than that. Because Admira and Boško didn't die because of ancient tribal hatred. They didn't die because Serbs and Bosniaks were natural enemies. They died because someone had spent years carefully building a machine designed to make neighbors see each other as threats, to transform coexistence into suspicion, and suspicion into violence. And this is what that machine looked like from the inside. Most people think Yugoslavia collapsed because of ancient hatreds, because Serbs and Croats and Bosniaks had always been enemies. That is not what happened. What happened was a deliberate operation. Designed, tested, deployed, and the people it was used on had no idea it was happening. Yugoslavia, 1980, population, 22 million, 6 republics, dozens of ethnic groups, 3 major religions, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, living not just side by side, but together. In Bosnia alone, intermarriage rates between ethnic groups were among the highest in Europe. Nearly 1 in 3 marriages crossed ethnic lines. People shared apartments, schools, workplaces, celebrations. For decades, this was held up as proof that the world's most complicated ethnic geography could work, that people were capable of choosing each other over categories. By 1995, over 100,000 of them were dead. And the question that survivors, researchers, and historians have been asking ever since is not what happened. The facts are documented. The question is how. How do you dismantle a society that integrated? How do you make people who shared meals start digging graves? The answer is more mechanical than most people want to believe, and far more deliberate. To understand the collapse, you first have to understand what held the country together. One man, Josip Broz Tito, a communist partisan leader who unified Yugoslavia after World War II through political ruthlessness and a carefully constructed mythology. In 1943, while the war was still being fought, Tito gathered his commanders. He told them, "Do not speak of national differences. We are all partisans. We are all Yugoslavs." It was not an invitation. It was an order. His formula was simple. Ethnic identity was dangerous, so it would be suppressed. You were Yugoslav first. Everything else was secondary. He built a system where claiming Serb or Croat identity above Yugoslav identity was politically punishable, and it appeared to work. Yugoslavia became the most prosperous socialist state in the world. Yugoslavs could travel freely when citizens of other communist countries could not. They had passports, Western music, consumer goods, a kind of socialism that almost felt comfortable. But here is the uncomfortable truth about systems built on suppression. They don't dissolve grievances. They store them. When Tito died in 1980, the lid came off, and underneath it, decades of unresolved historical wounds were still very much alive, waiting for someone to find them useful. Before we continue, we created the Jovrah Files for people who want to understand what's really happening behind the surface. Hidden societies, dictators, propaganda, strange systems, the stories most people never hear about. If you enjoy this type of documentary, and want to support the channel, consider subscribing. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps us create more videos like this. All right, let's get back to the story. The 1980s hit Yugoslavia like a slow collapse. Foreign debt climbed to $20 billion. Inflation reached 1,000%. Unemployment rose. Factories closed. People who had spent their entire adult lives believing in the system watched it fail in real time. And this is where something precise happened. Something that had been understood by political operatives for centuries. When people feel afraid, when the economic ground disappears beneath them, they stop asking systemic questions. They ask a simpler one: who is to blame? One man understood this better than anyone in Yugoslavia at that moment: Slobodan Milosevic. In 1987, he visited Kosovo, a region with an Albanian majority and a significant Serb minority. Local Serbs complained they were being mistreated. There were scuffles outside. Police moved in. Milosevic stepped outside to the crowd and said something that had never been spoken at that level of Yugoslav politics. He said, "No one should dare to beat you." 6 words. And the crowd's reaction was caught on camera. Something that looked like relief, like recognition, like someone had finally given them permission to say out loud what they had been told for decades to keep silent. Milosevic had found the formula. Suppress the Yugoslav identity, amplify the Serb one, offer people a tribe when the state has failed them. And then, crucially, give the tribe an enemy. What followed was one of the most calculated propaganda operations in modern European history. The real mechanism becomes visible here. State television, which Milosevic systematically brought under his control, began a coordinated campaign of historical reactivation. World War II, atrocities, real ones, committed by Croatian Ustaša forces against Serbs, were reintroduced into daily life, not as history, as present threat. The line between 1943 and 1991 was deliberately blurred. On television, in newspapers, in political speeches, the message was never stated directly. It didn't need to be. They did it before. The bones are proof. What makes you think they won't do it again? But the operation went further than television, further than speeches and newspapers. It went into the ground. In 1991, mass graves from World War II were opened, publicly, on camera. The bones of Serb victims were exhumed and displayed at ceremonies broadcast to the entire nation. This was not historical remembrance. Grief was being manufactured into fear, and fear was being aimed at a specific target. One Serbian journalist who worked in state television during this period later described what happened inside the newsroom. They received instructions, which stories to run, which images to use, which words were permitted and which were not. The word massacre was reserved exclusively for violence against Serbs. The same act, committed against Bosniaks or Croats, was called an incident. Language was being rewired. Most people watching at home had no idea it was happening, because that is the nature of this kind of operation. It doesn't feel like propaganda when you're inside it. It feels like the news. The same machine was running on the Croatian side. Franjo Tudman, Croatia's nationalist leader, was systematically rehabilitating symbols from the Ustaša collaborationist era, a new currency named after a wartime regime, a flag that echoed iconography Serbs associated with mass killing. Whether intentional provocation or nationalist nostalgia, the effect was identical. Serbs living in Croatia looked at those symbols and felt what they were engineered to make them feel: fear, historical memory, the past returning. Croatian Serbs began arming. Croatian Croats began arming. And ordinary people who had lived together for decades began to look at their neighbors differently, not as individuals anymore, but as representatives, as categories as potential threats. Psychologists who study mass violence describe this as the most critical threshold in any atrocity, not the first shot. The first moment a person stops seeing their neighbor as a person, that is when the violence becomes possible. Everything after is just execution. And here is where the story becomes most difficult to understand, because Bosnia was the most dangerous place for this process to unfold. Because Bosnia was the most integrated republic in Yugoslavia. Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats didn't just share cities. They shared apartment buildings, streets, families. Nearly 1/3 of Bosnian marriages crossed ethnic lines. These were not communities waiting to explode. They were communities that had chosen, repeatedly, to live together, which meant the propaganda had to work harder here. It couldn't rely on physical separation or unfamiliarity. It had to overcome actual memory, real friendships, real shared history. So it targeted something deeper than politics. It targeted identity itself. The message was not simply, the other group is dangerous. It was more insidious than that. You were never really the same as them. What you called friendship was a misunderstanding. Your neighbor was always, underneath everything, something other than what you believed. Survivor testimonies describe the transformation with an eerie consistency. Neighbors who had been warm for years became cold, then distant, then absent. Then, in some cases, they arrived with lists, addresses. When Serb militias entered Bosnian towns in 1992, they knew which houses belonged to Muslim families. Someone had been compiling that information for a long time. The violence didn't arrive from outside. It came from inside the community. That is what makes Bosnia different from most conflicts, and that is what makes it so difficult to look at directly. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 1,425 days. Longer than the siege of Leningrad in World War II, snipers positioned in the surrounding hills received specific orders not to target soldiers, to target civilians, women crossing the market, children running between buildings. The goal was not military victory. It was psychological destruction, to make ordinary life lethal enough that the will of an entire population would break. Residents learned which streets had clear sniper lines of sight. They learned to run, to time their movements between shots. Children grew up understanding that certain intersections required a decision. Cross fast and hope, or don't cross at all. Over the 1,425 days, more than 11,000 people were killed in Sarajevo. More than 1,500 of them were children. The United Nations had peacekeepers present for most of it, with orders not to intervene. The official term was neutrality. In practice, it meant watching. July 1995, Srebrenica, the town had been officially designated a UN safe area. That designation was supposed to mean something. It meant that soldiers from the Dutch UN battalion, Dutchbat, were stationed there, armed, present, watching. Roughly 8,000 Bosniak Muslim men and boys were separated from women and children by Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic. They were taken to fields, warehouses, forests, and executed over several days. The largest massacre on European soil since the Second World War. But here is the detail that researchers keep returning to. Srebrenica was not chaos. It was paperwork. Lists were made, buses were scheduled, bulldozers were arranged. When investigators later began finding mass graves, they discovered the bodies had been moved, reburied in secondary locations. Evidence systematically relocated. This required planning, coordination, resources. It required not just killers. It required clerks, people who scheduled transport, people who signed requisition forms, People who never fired a single shot, but made every shot logistically possible. The machinery of genocide doesn't run on hatred alone. It runs on administration. After the war, researchers began studying what they called the ordinary perpetrator. The men who carried out killings in Bosnia were not, by most external measures, exceptional individuals. Many had no prior criminal history. They had families, trades, routines. What changed them? The research points to a sequence that appears with disturbing consistency across atrocities. Economic collapse creates fear. Fear creates the need for an explanation. Political actors supply that explanation in the form of an enemy. Media normalizes the framing over months and years, and then community pressure does the final work. Because very few acts of violence during the Bosnian War were committed alone. They happened in groups, in units. Social psychologists have documented for decades that group membership fundamentally alters moral decision-making. When the men around you comply, refusal becomes socially catastrophic. You are no longer refusing an order. You are separating yourself from the group, and in conditions of war, that separation can feel indistinguishable from death. This sequence is not unique to Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, Germany. The uncomfortable implication is that the capacity for this transformation is not exceptional. It is available. The conditions required to activate it are political, not biological, which means the real question is never whether it could happen somewhere else. The real question is whether the conditions are being assembled somewhere right now, and whether anyone inside them would even be able to tell. After the war, the International Tribunal prosecuted the architects. Milosevic died during his trial before a verdict. Mladic was convicted of genocide and sentenced to life. Karadzic received the same. But the ordinary participants were different. The ones who drove the buses, compiled the lists, looked away from specific windows at specific moments. Most were never prosecuted. They returned to their towns, their streets, in some cases to houses that had belonged to victims, and survivors had to decide every day how to exist in the same geography as people who had watched them be destroyed. No tribunal addresses that. No verdict resolves it. Admira and Boshko stayed on that bridge for 4 days. The city watched from windows. Neither side moved to retrieve them. Eventually, under pressure, they were buried together in the same grave. What their story reveals is not that Yugoslavia was uniquely cruel. It's that the country was deliberately, systematically taught to see itself differently. The war didn't begin with the first gunshot. It began inside television studios, in the selection of which images to broadcast, which words to authorize, which history to excavate and hold up in front of a frightened population. Ordinary people, in 1985, Yugoslavia could not have imagined what their country would become. They were not uniquely hateful. They were people who lived inside a system of information that was slowly, deliberately rewired, until the unthinkable became thinkable, until the neighbor became the enemy, until the couple on the bridge became acceptable losses for both sides. The architecture is always visible once you know what you're looking for. The only question history keeps asking is whether anyone noticed it being built and who was deciding what everyone else was allowed to see. That question did not die with Yugoslavia. It is being asked right now. In every country where the economy is failing and a television screen is telling people who is responsible, in every place where one word is permitted and another is banned, the machine that destroyed Yugoslavia didn't disappear. It just found new screens.